The phone buzzed at 3:07 a.m., and the screen showed Ryan said, "We need to talk." My chest cracked like ice under a boot, and the room forgot how to breathe. I stared at the message and whispered, "Please don't do this now." The air smelled like cold coffee and fear. A storm dragged its nails across the window, and I counted seconds between thunder and courage. Ryan said, "I can't keep this up," and I said, "What changed since yesterday?" The typing dots blinked like a life support machine. I swiped through our photos and begged the past to argue for me. Ryan said, "It's complicated," and I said, "Then untangle it with me." The silence was a locked door with my name on it. I remembered waiting by airports and video calls that froze on his smile. I pressed call, but it rang into a pit. I said, "Tell me there isn't someone else." The storm answered with a low growl. My voice shook. I held every promise like a candle. The message sat there like a loaded word. I placed the phone face down, but the glow crawled through my fingers. I said, "If you end this by text, I will never forgive you." I sat on the floor because the bed remembered better nights. My knees pressed to my chest as the dial tone replayed the distance between us. Jasmine said, "You cannot let a midnight text decide your worth." I said, "He promised October." The word tasted like dust in my mouth. The calendar on the wall still had a heart around the flight date. I whispered, "I kept waiting because he asked me to." Jasmine said he asked, but he did not arrive. I stared at the suitcase under my desk like it might unzip a miracle. I said, "Maybe the storm is just tonight." The power hummed like a warning. Jasmine said, "You deserve a phone call, not a cliff edge." I rubbed the airline tag until the letters faded under my thumb. I said, "If I stop believing, all the nights collapse at once." Jasmine breathed softly, then said, "Belief is not a receipt." I hugged the hoodie closer and tried to borrow warmth from a promise that would not return it. I opened our last thread and scrolled to the part where he said, "We will be unstoppable." I whispered, "I built a life around that sentence." The photos showed birthdays he missed, and the cake I ate alone. Ryan said, "Work is crazy," and I said, "My nights are louder without you." I wondered if loneliness had a time zone or just a body count. Jasmine said, "He likes your devotion more than your presence." I said, "He liked that I waited." A new message refused to appear, and I measured that refusal like a weather pattern. I typed, "Are you ending this?" then deleted it and typed, "I am still here." My reflection in the screen looked like someone who paid rent in hope. I said, "Tell me the truth, and I will survive it." The dots stayed dead. Somewhere a siren moved away, and the quiet returned like a dare. I placed the phone on the windowsill and left it there to ache. The storm softened into a steady hiss, and the clock blinked a stubborn green. I lined up his promises in my head like planes that never landed. Ryan said, "January for sure," and I said, "I can wait." I kept waiting like it was a job, and he was payroll. Jasmine said, "You keep collecting IS that never cash." I said, "He means it when he says it." Maybe meaning evaporates at the border of effort. I opened the suitcase and touched the neatly folded sweater he liked. I said, "This is the color you called sunrise." The thread caught on my ring and I yanked it free. I asked the ceiling, "If love is real, why does it need extensions?" The apartment sighed with the heater. I said, "I need him to pick up and say my name like a promise." The room swallowed my voice, then returned it smaller. Lightning was gone, but the ache kept flashing. I sat at the desk and opened a blank message. I typed, "If you are ending it, say it with your voice," then hovered. Ryan said, "You know I care." And I said, "Care's not a ticket." I could hear his laugh in my head, the one that made me forgive delays. I said, "I will not be your layover." The cursor blinked like a heartbeat I could not control. Jasmine said, "Close the app and sleep." And I said, "I am afraid of waking to silence." I backspaced until the field was clean, then typed, "Call me now." I hit send and watched the message leave like a small boat into a dark ocean. I placed the phone face up this time, daring it to betray me. I whispered, "Please prove me wrong." Morning crawled in like a reluctant witness, and I brewed coffee that tasted like another apology I would not receive. I opened my budgeting app and counted the hours I traded for airfare that never met me at arrivals. Elena said, "You built your days around a flight path that never lands." I traced the map pins we shared and felt the ocean widen inside my ribs. Jasmine said, "Tell me what you love outside of him." I said, "I love the way Hope arranges my mornings." She sighed, then said, "Hope should not be doing all the labor." I folded my work uniform and set it by the door like armor. Ryan said, "You are strong," and I said, "Strength is heavy at 6 a.m. The kettle clicked, and the apartment exhaled steam like a tired secret. I whispered, "I stayed because the waiting felt holy." The mug warmed my hands while my heart cooled. On the commute, I pressed my forehead to the train glass and watched buildings blur into the shape of waiting. Ryan said, "I hate that I am far," and I said, "Then move closer with your choices." The car hummed, and every station announced our unfinished business. I scrolled to the photo where he promised Thanksgiving, then Christmas, then spring. Elena said, "You kept shifting your life like luggage on a carousel." A child laughed 2 seats down, and the sound throbbed against my quiet. Jasmine said, "Distance is only honest when effort meets it halfway." I typed her, "What if he believes his own intentions?" She wrote back, "Intentions are coupons without cash." I smiled at the floor and felt the smile retreat. I said, "I am teaching my heart to speak in evidence." The doors opened, and cold air grated the morning blue. The cafe smelled like caramel and heat, and I wore my smile like a uniform accessory. My manager said, "You okay?" And I said, "Just a weather system." I poured shots that hissed like distant trains. Ryan said, "I am proud of you," and I said, "Come taste my life, not just my updates." A couple split a pastry and the tearing sound felt tender and cruel. Elena said, "I used to collect his promises in a jar and shake them for courage." Jasmine texted, "Your worth is not a delivery estimate." I slipped the phone away and built a latte heart that held. I said, "I want love that clocked in and stayed until close." The bell over the door jingled, and my heart rose for a stranger. I laughed at myself and kept steaming milk until the room fogged with forgiveness I had not received. Lunch break found me on the back steps, balancing a sandwich and a memory. Ryan said, "I will fly by October," and I said, "I will hold the month open like a door." October rusted into winter while I kept polishing the handle. Jasmine said, "What did you stop doing so you could keep waiting?" I said, "I paused grad school and called it timing." The truth settled beside me like a careful bird. Elena said, "You bartered futures for maybe." A delivery truck coughed awake, and the alley smelled like spice and rain. I scrolled to our budget sheet, where I hid small sacrifices as round numbers. I said, "If he calls tonight, I will forget this ache in one syllable." The thought startled me. I wrapped the sandwich and promised myself a better appetite. Evening returned me to the apartment where the clock still glowed patient and green. I lit a candle because the room needed a witness. Ryan said, "I want us," and I said, "Want is not travel." I spread postcards from the cities we planned and arranged them like a map of unsent arrivals. Jasmine said, "Anchor yourself to something that does not cancel." I pulled my guitar from under the bed and tuned the stubborn strings. Elena said, "I waited because love once sounded like this chord." The note rang and the air steadied. I whispered, "I matter even if he never knocks." The candle guttered and then stood tall again. I set an alarm for sleep and another for mercy. I said, "Tomorrow, I will ask for more than almost." The next morning, my phone offered a new silence, and I wore it like a bruise under clothing. Ryan said, "Work trip extended," and I said, "Extensions are not bridges." The train doors bit shut, and I flinched at the sound. Jasmine said, You keep grading storms like homework. I said, if I solve it, he returns. A flyer for cheap flights fluttered along the platform and landed on my shoe. I said, I could go to him, and the idea burned like a match. Ryan said, that would complicate things. And I said, complication already lives here. The conductor shouted, and I heard my name in the echo. I tucked the flyer in my pocket like a dare I could postpone. The sky held a hard gray, and the day moved without me. At the cafe, a new barista named Mira asked where my smile went, and I said, on break with my patience. The espresso hiss sounded like a warning sent in steam. Ryan said, I will call tonight. And I said, I have heard tonight speak fluent tomorrow. A couple argued softly by the window, and I felt every word land on my ribs. Jasmine said, trust is a muscle that atrophies in quiet. I said, mine is limping. I checked my phone under the counter, screen clean as bone. Ryan said, I care, and I said, care does not clock in. The grinder roared and swallowed my reply. A rush of orders pinned me to the present, and the present held like wet paper. I smiled until the edges hurt. Lunch break. I called, and it rang into a tunnel that never surfaced. Ryan said, I am in meetings, and I said, I am in consequences. A notification from a woman named Tessa flashed on his shared post, a small heart shaped like a threat. Jasmine said, do not pick a fight with the fog. I said, fog is still weather. I searched her profile and found photos from his city, too bright for my eyes. Ryan said, she is just a colleague, and I said, colleagues do not caption weekends. My chest felt lined with tin. The alley smelled like fryer oil and rain, and the wind kept moving the same napkin in circles. I whispered, I need proof of us that does not vanish. The napkin kept spinning. That evening, video chat finally connected, and his face appeared in hotel lamp light. Ryan said, you look tired, and I said I look like your schedule. He smiled, and it broke me with its ease. I asked about Tessa, and he blinked too slowly. Ryan said, office crew grabbed drinks, and I said, your absence grabbed my month. The lag swallowed my next breath and returned it late. Jasmine texted, stay on your script. Ask then listen. I said, will you book a ticket by Friday? He counted days like loose change. Ryan said, let me check, and I said, I have been checking for 2 years. The call froze on his careful face, then died. After the call died, the apartment went loud with the quiet. I laid out receipts like tarot and asked them what I had paid. Ryan said soon, and I said, soon is a hallway with no doors. I scrolled to Tessa's page and closed it before it could cut me again. Jasmine said, name your boundary out loud, and I said, Friday or finished. The words sat between me and the lamp like witnesses. I wrote them on a sticky note and pressed it to the calendar. Ryan said, don't be dramatic, and I said, dramatic is cheaper than denial. The clock inhaled and exhaled its green breath. I turned off the phone and let the dark be a verdict I could survive. Friday arrived like a verdict, and the phone stayed mute. I boiled pasta and could not swallow. Ryan said, I lost track of days, and I said, I tattooed them on my chest. Jasmine said, he counts nothing but his own hours. I checked the sticky note on the calendar, the word, finished, glowing like a dare. Ryan said, I will make it up to you, and I said, debt is not love. My fork scraped the bowl like nails on quiet. Outside children laughed, and the sound stung like salt. I whispered, if love survives oceans, why can't it survive honesty? The silence throbbed back. The message came late. Ryan said, I need to be honest. My stomach folded. He wrote, there's someone else, but it isn't serious. I said, not serious still kills. Jasmine called, and I answered with silence. She said, say it out loud. I said, he picked another orbit. The room tilted, and my chest broke into 2 rhythms. Ryan said, I didn't mean for it to happen. and I said you meant for me to wait anyway. The candle I lit trembled, its flame thin with fear. I whispered, I was never competing until you chose an audience. I walked out into the rain because the walls carried too much memory. Ryan said, you are still my anchor, and I said, anchors drown ships too. The streets shone with neon bleeding into puddles. I wanted the storm to wash away the last 2 years. Jasmine texted, you don't have to hold what he dropped. I said, but I built my hands around it. A bus hissed past, spraying water over my shoes. Ryan said, we can figure this out, and I said, you already solved it with someone else. The rain whispered louder than his excuses. Back home, I peeled off wet clothes and sat wrapped in a towel, staring at the suitcase still waiting under my desk. Ryan said, we'll talk tomorrow, and I said, I've been living in tomorrows. The towel clung like armor against emptiness. Jasmine said, you don't owe him one more sunrise. I said, but I owe myself the truth. I dragged the suitcase out and unzipped it, half-packed clothes, smelling faintly of hope. I whispered, this was meant for reunion, not escape. The zipper screeched like a wound tearing open. The night ended with me writing words I swore I'd never need. I typed, you broke us and let it sit. Ryan said, please don't end it this way, and I said, you already did. The blinking cursor mocked me like unfinished grief. Jasmine said, press, send for yourself. I said, this is my goodbye gift. My thumb hovered, then fell. The whoosh of the sent message was small, but it split the silence wide. I whispered, this is the sound of me choosing me. The clock clicked over midnight, and the day closed behind me. Morning rose sharp and thin, and my phone lit up with his name like a wound reopening. Ryan said, we need to talk properly, and I said, proper died last night. His voice trembled through the speaker, and it shook my kitchen clock. Jasmine said, answer only if you want to, but my thumb already pressed accept. Ryan said, I made a mistake. And I said, mistake is what you call it when you want forgiveness cheaper than truth. The kettle screamed in the background, boiling water for no one. I whispered, I gave you years, and you gave me silence. He exhaled into static, and I swore the air thin. I walked circles in the apartment as his excuses poured like broken glass. Ryan said, she meant nothing. And I said, nothing doesn't ruin everything. His voice cracked, but it sounded rehearsed. Jasmine texted, don't let him build his alibi in your heart. I said, you knew I would wait, so you kept me waiting. The words left my mouth like smoke I couldn't pull back. Ryan said, I still love you. And I said, love that betrays is just hunger. My hands shook as I gripped the chair, grounding myself against collapse. The walls pulsed with every word. The argument rose like fire. Ryan said, don't throw us away. And I said, you already threw me. My voice cracked into something I barely recognized. I slammed the desk with my palm, and the candle toppled, wax spilling like blood. Jasmine called mid-chaos, but I ignored it, needing every scream to land. Ryan said, we can fix this, and I said, fix is for what still works. The silence after my shout startled even me. His breathing filled the line, shallow and guilty. I whispered, I am not your waiting room anymore. He shouted back, the first time his anger matched mine. Ryan said, you make everything impossible. And I said I only asked for presents, not miracles. The echo rang in my ribs. My reflection in the dark window looked like a stranger rehearsing goodbye. Ryan said, if you walk, you'll regret it. And I said, regret already moved in with me months ago. Jasmine's text lit my screen again. Endings are not losses, they are exits. My throat burned with both fury and release. I whispered, this is me leaving. The call ended not with a goodbye, but with a click sharp as glass snapping. I stood frozen, phone heavy as stone in my hand. Ryan said, you'll come back, but I didn't reply. I whispered, that was the last time your voice owned my room. The clock ticked loud enough to fill the silence. Jasmine called, and I answered this time. She said, "Breathe, you're free now." I exhaled and felt ribs unclench for the first time in years. My knees buckled, but the floor caught me gently. The apartment finally felt mine. Morning arrived without his shadow, and the apartment felt wider, like lungs relearning air. I made oatmeal and let the spoon rest without apology. Jasmine said, "Begin with one gentle thing," and I said, "I will not check his pages today." The vow settled like a small stone in a river, redirecting the current. I opened a new playlist and named it after. Ryan said, "We can talk when you're calmer," and I said, "Calm is not an exit door you get to hold." I muted his thread and felt the quiet align with the walls. I wrote a list that started with groceries and ended with forgiveness, and I circled only the first item. Jasmine said, "You do not have to be brave yet," and I said, "I can be ordinary." I tasted the oatmeal and it tasted like mine. The clock ticked and did not accuse me. I walked to the park where the city keeps its quiet, and the wind braided itself through bare branches. Jasmine said, "Grief needs movement," and I said, "So does hope." Runners passed like metronomes, reminding me the body knows rhythm beyond heartache. I sat on a bench and let the sun write new warmth on my face. Ryan said, "I miss your voice," and I said, "My voice is busy learning me." I unsaved our travel alerts, and the map inside me shifted from us to north, south, here. A dog bounded by and shook rain from its coat like a sermon on release. Jasmine said, "Tell the earth what you are keeping," and I said, "I am keeping my name." I exhaled and watched my breath vanish into air that did not hoard it. At lunch with my mother, the table held steam and history. She said, "We worried you were disappearing," and I said, "I was practicing absence like a language." She poured tea, and her hands shook in the tiny way I inherited. Ryan said, "Your family never liked me," and I said they disliked the waiting. My mother said, "Love should not require you to vanish," and the sentence settled like a quilt. I nodded and let honesty rest between us without defense. Jasmine texted, "Let safety count as romance," and I said, "I am learning that math." The soup tasted like something I did not have to earn. My mother smiled, and the room straightened. Back at the cafe, I asked for more hours and for fewer ghosts. My manager said, "You make storms taste sweet," and I laughed for real. I tuned the grinder by sound, and muscle memory returned like an old friend. Ryan said, "You blocked me everywhere," and I said, "I unblocked myself." A regular slid a note across the counter that read, "Your latte art saved my morning," and I pinned it near the clock. Jasmine said, "Put evidence on the wall," and I said, "I will build a museum of ordinary victories." The milk lifted into a heart that did not tremble. I whispered, "I am here, and I am working," and the day agreed. That night I unpacked the suitcase I had kept like an altar. I folded each shirt with a blessing and a goodbye. Ryan said, "We could still be friends," and I said, "Friends do not live in the ruins they made." I placed the coral sweater back into the drawer, and felt the drawer accept the weight without protest. Jasmine said, "Claim a room he never visited," and I said, "I claimed this one." I lit a new candle and named it Future. The flame stood straight, as if the air had stopped arguing. I wrote, "I choose myself," on a fresh sticky note and placed it over the old one. The room exhaled, and so did I. The city woke in frost, and I walked streets that once felt like holding cells. Ryan said, "You'll regret this distance," and I said, "Distance is lighter than betrayal." The morning air sliced my lungs, but it felt like permission. Jasmine said, "Your steps sound like freedom," and I said, "I'm learning their rhythm." I passed the travel agency where we once circled brochures, and I paused only long enough to smile at the irony. The posters promised getaways, but I carried my return in my own chest. I whispered, "I am not waiting at airports anymore." A bus whooshed by, and the wind carried my words forward. I met Jasmine for coffee, and the air between us hummed with survival. She said, "Your eyes look rested," and I said, They stopped scanning the horizon. We clinked mugs like it was a holiday. Ryan said, "I still love you." And I said, "Love that hurts is not love I want." Jasmine laughed softly, then said, "You don't sound like someone rehearsing anymore." I said, "I am writing now." The table between us felt solid, not fragile. Outside, people hurried, but inside, I breathed like the world was finally wide. At home, I opened the old photo box, and my hands no longer shook. Ryan's smile stared from glossy paper, and I said, "You were a chapter, not the book." I stacked his photos in an envelope and sealed it with tape that sounded like finality. Jasmine said, "Do not burn them, let them fade." I said, "Fading is kinder." I placed the envelope in the back of the closet, behind winter coats and untouched gifts. I whispered, "You don't live here anymore." The silence didn't argue, it agreed. I sat by the window, guitar across my lap, and strummed until the strings stopped sounding like grief. Ryan said, "You'll never find someone like me." And I said, "That's the point." The melody stumbled into something new, raw but alive. Jasmine texted, "Record that, it sounds like you." I smiled and kept playing, letting the air stitch itself with notes. The city lights blinked like applause I hadn't asked for. I whispered, "This is my anthem of leaving." The last chord rang, and it didn't echo loneliness, it echoed return. Midnight found me on the balcony, candle flickering beside me. The phone lay silent, but for the first time it didn't ache. Ryan said, "We'll talk soon," and I said, "Not anymore." I breathed in the cold air and felt it carve me lighter. Jasmine said, "What is your final word?" And I said, "Goodbye." The stars scattered above like unwritten promises, and I decided not to chase them. I whispered, and that was the last time his name ever lit up my phone. The silence pressed against me, not heavy, but holy.